Jonas, you know how most companies are obsessing over whether to use plastic, glass, or cardboard packaging?
Yes.
And do you know what the most sustainable packaging actually is?
Is it paper? No. Is it recycled paper or recycled plastic?
No. The most sustainable packaging is actually no packaging.
Oh, it's a trick question, I see.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, fair enough, I guess.
Yeah. So today we're opening the box and then questioning whether the box needed to exist in the first place. Let's set the scene. The packaging industry contributes to an estimated 5 to 6% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, right? Which is more than aviation. And it's not just one industry, it's five very different ones. And each of them have their own emissions profile and their sustainability story.
Okay, tell me more. Give me the
Yeah.
landscape.
Yeah. So plastic is the biggest by far, roughly half the global market by volume. So there's Amcor, Berry Global, and those are the giants that are actually merging right now. Then there is paper and cardboard. So there's Tetra Pak, Smurfit Westrock, the second largest segment, and the one growing fastest right now because everyone is fleeing plastic, right? Then there's metal, which is mostly aluminum cans and steel. It's dominated by Ball Corporation and Crown Holdings. Then there's glass, which is beautiful, infinitely recyclable in theory, actually recycled at very different rates depending on where you are. And they're usually dominated by Ardagh Glass and Owens, Illinois. And then there's wood, which is pallets, crates, industrial transit packaging, largely invisible to the end consumer, but it's a massive part of the FMCG supply chain.
Okay, and interestingly, like I think when you ask a sustainability manager at an FMCG company what their top three decarbonization priorities are, what their reduction levers are, I feel like packaging is rarely one of them. I feel like packaging is really the thing that they only deal with when they've got some budget left over at the end of the day.
Yeah. Which is it's a structural problem, right? Because companies like Nestle, PepsiCo, L'Oreal, they've all made packaging commitments. So less virgin plastic, more recycled content, reuse models, but these goals have largely been kept in isolation from their science-based targets or their net zero commitments.
Right, because packaging sustainability lives in the sustainability or in the circularity team,
Yeah.
and carbon lives in the ESG team. So they don't always necessarily have lunch together.
Yeah, exactly. And for food and beverage specifically, on average, packaging accounts for around 5% of the energy used in the life cycle of a food product. It's
Speaking
huge.
of which, I would like to talk about the pivot.
The pivot?
Yeah, over the last few years, FMCG companies have been quietly, sometimes loudly, switching packaging from plastic to paper. Mars switched chocolate bar wrappers. Nestle launched paper wrapped Kit Kats. And they published that brand approval went up 17% just from the Kit Kat wrappers change.
Yeah, which it's a good hint that some sustainability decisions are sometimes made by the marketing team instead.
Exactly, yeah. And here's the problem. The carbon math on paper versus plastic is genuinely complicated, and most consumer communication pretends that it isn't,
Yeah, because the instinct is plastic bad, paper good. Paper is natural, paper degrades, paper doesn't end up in the ocean.
which is all very true. But at the same time, paper is heavier, it's more energy intensive to produce per kilogram, and in food packaging, replacing plastic with paper leads to higher food spoilage rates. And food spoilage has its own significant, often unquantified carbon cost.
True. So the paper saved the plastic waste, but the yogurt went off 2 days earlier and got thrown out, which is worse for the climate.
Yeah, a paper bag actually emits over three times more CO2 than a plastic bag at production.
Okay.
Paper's biogenic carbon uptake can close that gap, but only under specific life cycle methodologies for specific applications. So it's an easy gap to greenwash into. So a thin paper wrapper that also contains a plastic liner, which you need for the moisture barrier for food, is no longer just paper packaging. It's more of a paper hat on a plastic coat.
Does photograph well, you have to
It
admit.
does, yeah. There's also then the regulatory layer. There is the EU packaging regulation, the Green Claims Directive, the EUDR, which touches on deforestation linked materials such as paper and cardboard. So the direction of the regulations is very clear. It's all about reduce, reuse, recycle. But the specific requirements are a moving maze. And some companies are really using that as an excuse, really.
So it's the we're waiting for regulatory clarity before committing the targets is not really a strategy, right? It's a hiding system.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. But for example, the brands, so the Nestle's and the Unilevers, they make headlines on this, right? But the real leverage in packaging emissions sits upstream with the manufacturers, actually.
Exactly. So we're talking the companies you mentioned earlier, the Amcor, Smurfit Westrock, Ball Corporation, Ardagh, Tetra Pak, Brambles. Not exactly your household names that most individuals might be familiar with.
Yeah.
But if you work in FMCG, they're almost certainly in your scope 3. And so for flexible plastics, SBTI approved targets certainly exist, but the recycled content only sits at 5% against a 30% target for 2030. So the
Quite far.
hotspot for flexible plastics is really the virgin resin production. So the fossil-based polymers that are carbon intensive at origin and the recycled content at scale just really isn't there yet. Then for paper and cardboard, the hotspot is really in the pulp production. So
Yeah.
the energy intensive chemical processing, the hard to decarbonize process heat, and unfortunately also the fiber quality that degrades with each recycling cycle. For glass, the hotspot is melting the raw materials at 1,500 degrees Celsius, which obviously takes
Quite
huge
high, yeah.
energy use. And also the cullet collection remains patchy. There are some electric furnace pilots and some hydrogen trials underway in Europe, but it's still very early, I would say.
Yeah.
For aluminum, it's actually the cleanest story here because aluminum doesn't degrade through recycling.
Yeah.
Ball Corporation it targets, for example, 85% recycled content by 2030. But the hotspot for the aluminum industry is the primary smelting, where energy
Yeah.
intensive electrolysis fills any gap between recycled input and actual demand.
Yeah.
Then maybe two more I want to quickly bring up as well. So the
Okay.
multi-layer cartons, which we already
Yeah.
quickly touched upon. Companies like Tetra Pak, they have very strong operational numbers, like 94% renewable electricity,
Yeah.
54% scope 1 and 2 reduction. But their hotspot, in effect, is the end of life, where the laminate structure, which is really the combination of the paper board, the plastic, the aluminum foil, it really defeats most recycling infrastructure. So this laminated carton only has a global recycling rate of about 28%. And this is across
Quite
174
low.
billion units that they are producing a year. And lastly, wood. Here I want to quickly touch upon Brambles, which has a inherently circular model where their company Shep, which is basically a wooden pallet pooler. So basically, the wooden pallets are being repaired, recirculated, rather than discarded. Interestingly, their hotspot is in the transportation and not in the manufacturing.
Yeah.
So when you have low return rates or high empty trip ratios, it really drives up the footprint fast. But, which I really highly support, Brambles issues each customer with an emission factor that is specific to how this specific customer is using their system. So including the return rates, the distances traveled, and the volumes.
Yeah. Yeah. So then that would mean that if you return the pallets faster and closer, your number would improve, right?
Exactly.
And then the supplier has structurally incentivized the customer to contribute to its circularity. I mean, for any other company out there, I would definitely say that's a model that's worth stealing, to be
Yeah.
honest. Which is also, it's why I think wood packaging, which does sound like the least innovative category, is sitting on one of the most replicable circular economy ideas in the sector.
Yeah, it really does. And now maybe moving on, what should FMCG companies actually be doing? Because just material switching from plastic to paper is really a very incomplete solution.
Yeah, definitely. I would say there are quite a few levers. So there's lever one, which is, I would say, the source reduction. Basically, use less material, right? So Coca-Cola, the world's biggest plastic polluter, redesigned their PET bottle with 15% less plastic and saved nearly 10,000 tons of PET per year across its supply chain. So there's no really a material swap, it's just less material. This doesn't typically make the press release because it's not really an exciting thing to photograph, but it is exciting when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah.
I would say for lever two is the recycled content. And you just have to use this as a procurement target with the supply chain to back it up, right? So your packaging supplier's recycled content percentage is your scope 3 number. So you really have to ask for this explicitly and
Hmm.
yeah, be more engaged with your suppliers.
Hmm.
For lever 3, it's the design for recyclability. Like I mentioned, it's monomaterial structures. So removing laminates, mixed coatings, additives that contaminate the recycling systems. I know that Berry Global actually redesigned the Heinz ketchup bottles closure so that it's a monomaterial polypropylene. It's not really exciting, but the cap is actually recyclable now, which is not that common. It's not as common as you would think.
Hmm.
Then for lever four, I would say the supplier energy transition. If your packaging supplier is still running on fossil energy, every package they make for you carries that in your scope 3. So, like you mentioned before, Tetra Pak being at 94% renewable electricity, that really sets a benchmark. So you have to ask your suppliers where they are on this. And I would say the final lever would be the one that moves the most carbon, but it actually scales the slowest, which is reuse, right? So refill systems, return models, like you mentioned, Brambles has proven that the model works at scale for industrial packaging, right? The question here becomes who is going to build it for consumer packaging next?
Right. So, in conclusion, paper versus plastic is not really the correct question to ask. And the question is, what's the full life cycle, environmental cost of this packaging, and what's the minimum that I actually need?
Yeah. I mean, after everything that we've talked about today, we can really see that the packaging industry is moving,
Yes, but the
right?
simplistic consumer narrative of now available in sustainable paper packaging is really cutting corners on the underlying science. And that gap is where a lot of greenwashing lives.
True, true. And I would say that the companies that connect their packaging decisions to their actual climate targets, not just their waste targets, will be very ahead of the regulation and very ahead of their competitors when the time comes.
Yeah, I mean, the wrapper matters. What's
Yeah.
inside the wrapper matters more. But the most important packaging question is whether the wrapper needed to exist at all.